Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. I'm joined, as I am every week for the show, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again, and welcome back for another round.
Yes, good to be here with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, likewise. The so-called debt ceiling is coming up for renewal, or
Yes.
maybe requiring the government to adhere to it. So I thought this would be a good time to address it again.
Right.
It seems like just yesterday that the debt ceiling was reached. It was about maybe a couple of years ago. And so here we are 2 years later, and the debt ceiling is reached again. And I have absolutely no doubts, Richard, that we're going to be hit with all the chicken little scenarios that we are hit with every time by the mainstream press of, oh my gosh, the government's going to have to shut down if people go all the way up to the debt ceiling and don't raise it again, and the society will collapse and there'll be a giant default. And we go through this every time. Now, what is the debt ceiling? It really is just an acknowledgement by Congress that too much debt is a bad thing. It's saying this is the maximum amount of debt that the government will be permitted to incur. We don't want it to go past that. Otherwise, it becomes extremely dangerous if the government is incurring so much debt. And yet, despite that acknowledgement, they continue increasing it each time. And I said this 2 years ago, and I've said it every time the debt ceiling is raised, that as soon as it's raised, you would expect all the people who were saying, oh, we have to raise it, to say, well, now that we've raised it, we need to cut government spending in anticipation of the next time that the debt ceiling is reached. Nobody ever says that. The only ones that are calling for decreases in government spending are libertarians. So they just go merrily on their way. They laugh and celebrate over the fact that they manipulated people into raising the debt ceiling again, and then they just advocate more government spending, more deficit spending, until here we are now again, the debt ceiling is being reached. My position is the debt ceiling should not be increased at all. That which would require the government to live within its means. In other words, tax revenues equal expenditures, because the government would be prohibited from incurring any more debt. What do you think?
Well, I think that's the nail on the head. The fact is that a debt limit says to the federal government that Uncle Sam can spend no more on expenditures of social welfare programs, defense, other types of expenditures, can spend no more than it's taking in from various sources of tax revenue. The same way that you and I have a hard budget constraint. We earn a certain amount of income from performing a job, a profession, an activity, and that is the constraint that then requires us to decide to prioritize, to determine what is more important and less important, and to keep our expenditures within what our budget will permit. Now, that was what the United States government more or less did for about the first 150 years of its existence. Yeah, I guess about at least 130 years of its existence. Now, this took the form of what economists such as the Nobel Prize winner James Buchanan and a colleague of his, Richard Wagner, referred to in their book Democracy and Deficit many years ago as the unwritten fiscal constitution. Now, there is nothing in the United States Constitution that requires the federal government to balance its budget. It can run a balanced budget, it can run a balanced deficit, it can run a balanced surplus, which is unlike many state constitutions that require, within rather narrow confines, that the state government balance its books on an annual basis. But as Buchanan and Wagner and others have pointed out, for about the first 125, 130 years, certainly, of the U.S. history, the rule was that whether it's in the Constitution or not, the proper procedures for the U.S. government to spend no more than it takes in taxes, that this assured honesty and transparency to the voters and the taxpayers, If a politician says, tell you what I'm going to do, you vote for me on election day, and I will give you this, 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 and this. He had to explain where the taxes would come from, because $1 more of spending could only occur through an increase in taxes by an equivalent amount. So he had to say how much the taxes were going to have to go up and upon whom the tax incidence was going to fall. That is, who was going to pay so much as best as the government could project to cover the greater expenditures. Or he would have to say, tell you what I'm going to do, I'm going to increase this program if you vote for me. But if he doesn't want to say where the taxes are going to come from as an increase in taxes, he had to explain what existing government program would have to be cut or ended to transfer the money over to the area in which he proposed an expansion of spending. Now, if you look at an economic history or a graph of the fiscal history of the United States, you find that there were ups and downs in the 19th century where the government ran a budget deficit, and this usually occurred during wars. The War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War. But the rule was also that if an emergency arose and a temporary deficit had to be run, once the crisis was over, then the government should run a budget surplus to pay off the debt in as timely a manner as possible so as not to burden both the current and future generations with the cost of paying for an emergency that concerned the earlier generation of citizens. And in fact, that occurred. After the War of 1812, the debt went down. Until when? In fact, in the 1830s, when Andrew Jackson was president, the debt practically reached zero and a balanced budget. Then there was borrowing again during the Mexican War, but following the Mexican War, the debt went down. Even after the Civil War, which involved a huge increase of debt under the Lincoln administration, from 1865 until into the 1890s, debt was going down, was being paid off by budget surpluses. It had a small blip with the Spanish-American War, and there was an increase again funding part of the America's participation in the First World War. But even that, in the 1920s, the debt came down. That all changed beginning in the 1930s with the coming of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and then the arrival of Keynesian economics and the idea that it was necessary and appropriate for government to run huge budget deficits during bad times, like in the Depression, and then we'll make up for it, not in the current fiscal year, but in future years when in good times, full employment, the economy is growing, we can afford a surplus then. So balancing the budget over the business cycle rather than on an annual basis, except for those occasional war emergency. And then following the war, and particularly from the 1960s on, the debt has exploded. In fact, since 1945, the United States government has run a budget deficit in each of its annual budgets every year except for about 6 or 7 years. Now, you can't tell me that since 1945, except for 6 or 7 years, we have been in a recession or depression requiring Keynesian deficit stimulus. What it did is it opened the floodgates to special interest groups, Jacob. The idea is that now the rationale can be, we need to improve the job situation. We need more infrastructure. We need more defense spending. Those damn commies are threatening us. Everything could be justified to if not raise taxes, then to run larger budget deficits. And why was this a useful tool for politicians and special interest groups? Because you see, then the politician could go before the public and say, I'm going to give you something for nothing. Or if not for nothing, less than its full price. Tell you what I'm going to do. Elect me, and I'll build your roads. I'll expand defense spending in your districts. And even let's say that it would total cost $100, I'm only going to charge you in taxes $60 or $70. Who's going to turn down a bargain when something that has a value of $100 is offered to them at 60 or 70? Who turns away from a sale if the product looks attractive? Now, this is what they were able to do, Jacob. Now, with a balanced budget, you can't do that. Now, in the current situation, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that in this current federal government fiscal year, that began on October 1 and will run until the end of September of this year, the government will have expenditures of approximately $3.96 trillion, while revenues will only be in the neighborhood of $3.4 trillion. Or they estimate a budget deficit of about $660 billion. Now, this is going to be adding to a debt that has been expanding and growing exponentially. And again, if I could just sort of give the numbers, it took from 1790, about the time the United States government came into existence, 1790 until 1980, at the time when Ronald Reagan was elected, for the U.S. government to accumulate $1 trillion of debt, $1 trillion, between 1980 and the year 2000. The Reagan administration, the Bush Sr., and then Clinton. From 1980 to 2000, the debt went from $1 trillion to $5 trillion. But then in the 8 years of George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009, it doubled from 5 to 10 trillion. And now, with the 8 years of the Barack Obama administration, it has doubled again to just below $20 trillion. And the Congressional Budget Office is estimating that with the current entitlement programs and the expected trajectory of government spending and anticipated taxes under current legislation, between now and 2027, that is the 2027, the next 10 years, is going to increase another 50%. In other words, to at least $30 trillion. This is out of control, out of control. And if there's no other way, then we should push for a balanced budget approach that at least slows down and then makes the voter citizen face the fact that there are no free lunches, or certainly not a lunch at a price less than what it's really going to cost. Because every dollar that the government taxes is $1 less in the pocket of the citizen. In other words, shall the government spend that dollar out of your pocket, or will you, as the private citizen who hopefully has honestly earned it, have it in your pocket to spend as you think best on yourself, your family, or any other private sector causes that you think are worthwhile? A balanced budget would force the American people to decide and evaluate what is it that they want government to do, what should be the role of government, and what are they willing to pay for when the full price tag is right in front of them and delivered them on tax day as what is expected from them to pay.
I think it's important to, from a libertarian perspective, to distinguish between two issues here. One is, what should be the role of government in a free society, and the other is, should there be a balanced budget here? So that even though we're advocating a balanced budget, that certainly doesn't mean that we support all the things that government is still spending on. That what you're really saying here is that the fact that the government is mounting massive amount of debt incurs a risk, a danger to the country, separate and apart from the fact that government is doing a lot of things it shouldn't be doing. Yeah. So that we would advocate that the government rein in spending in order to stop incurring this massive amount of debt, even though we don't support what the government is still doing. And as you point out, the amount of debt is now $20 trillion, and those figures you cited are incredible. In fact, before I forget, you've written a fantastic article on this subject that we're going to be posting on FFF's website today, called "The National Debt Ceiling Equals a Balanced Budget." And that's the important thing, I think, that we want to recognize as part of the deficit balanced budget debt ceiling part of the equation. And that is that this massive amount of debt is extremely risky for a country. We can look to Greece, for example, where the government incurred massive amounts of debt, the same way the U.S. government is incurred. And then finally, things get to a point where the taxpayer can't sustain the burden anymore. He can't sustain the burden of the massive taxes that are being used to pay for the welfare state, things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, aid to foreign dictatorships, and the like. And then he can't sustain the tax burden to finance the debt. And so things start to implode in that society until finally the government says, we can't go on. We can't collect enough taxes. We can't keep raising taxes because we keep putting businesses out of business, which makes the situation even worse. So things finally implode, and that's what's happening in Greece. And of course, they've been bailed out. There's going to be no bailing out if the U.S. government suffers the same problem. We can look at Puerto Rico. Exact same thing. Massive amount of debt till finally the citizenry cannot handle it anymore and things start to implode. Well, here, that if you take that $20 trillion that the government owes right now, according to a website called usdebtclock.org, and I'd recommend everybody go visit that website. It's a real stunning website, and you'll see what I mean when you see it. You just type in usdebtclock.org. That amount of money, Richard, $20 trillion equals $166,000 per taxpayer, American taxpayer.
Yes, well, it's immense.
Yeah, just think about it. I mean, how many people could afford to all of a sudden, pay their $166,000? That's per taxpayer. Suppose you've got a couple. Now you're talking about that you're in debt because the taxpayers are on the hook for this thing for some $330,000. I mean, that's an incredible amount of money. And that's what people need to keep in mind here. That as the government incurs more debt and keeps adding to this mountain of debt, that ultimately is saddling American taxpayers with that liability. It may not have to appear on your balance sheet if you go and get a loan from the bank, but you owe it nonetheless. And there's only one real solution to this from a fiscal standpoint, and that is to just slash the spending so that what you're bringing in is equal to your expenditures. Now, even that doesn't take care of the debt, though. The only thing that you can do to take care of the debt is to have tax revenues exceeding the expenditures, and then you use that surplus to pay down the debt. Now, again, you and I are not defending taxation. We're not defending what the government's doing in these things, but what I would suggest is that there's plenty of things the government could do to slash spending and still not default on the debt. You see, because they keep saying, oh, they're going to have, if you don't raise the debt ceiling, there has to be a default on the debt. No, there doesn't. All you have to do is just slash other spending programs, like the drug war. You could legalize drugs in the drug war. You could bring all the troops home from Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Middle East, saving massive amounts of money. You could close overseas military bases. You could close domestic military bases. You could abolish Medicare and Medicaid. You could abolish Social Security for that matter. I mean, you could abolish farm subsidies, foreign aid. So there's any host of things that you could do. But the problem, Richard, as you pointed out, is that so many people are dependent on the largesse now that nobody wants to slash those programs because they think that they wouldn't survive without them.
Right. You've been pointing out, what does this debt represent per taxpayer, about that $166,000 per taxpayer in the United States. I mentioned in the article one other way of thinking about it. The American gross domestic product, that is the market value of all output produced during 2016, is estimated to have been about $18.6 trillion. But with our debt of $20 trillion, that means that if we had taken the entire national income of 2016, leaving nothing else for anybody to live on, and just used that to pay off the debt, we would still be $1.5 trillion short of just paying off the damn debt. Now, that itself talks about that it's larger than the annual economic pie. Now, the other point that you raised is that it says nothing about what government should do per se, and you're right. But one can think of a debt ceiling, and a hard one, as like any other constitutional restraint. These are the functions and duties of the government, and it's not to exceed or go beyond that under its responsibilities to protect the life and the liberties of the citizenry. All this is saying is it doesn't assure that the government won't raise taxes. It doesn't mean or assure that the government won't spend more, but it can act as a restraint to make the citizens cognizant of what it is that government is doing and what it's going to cost them. And in that itself, it acts as a mechanism to at least compel people to ask themselves, is what government doing really worth what it's going to cost me? And therefore the deeper question, well, what is it that government should do that wouldn't be burdensome on me? And that at least is an avenue to get in a direction of asking the deeper questions about the role and purpose of government in a free society.
Yeah, and it's a question that really young people should be asking, because they're the ones that are now feeling the enormity of this burden of taxation and debt. I've heard of young people that are still living at home into their late 20s and 30s. They're delaying marriage. They're delaying having children. They can't buy a home. They can't get a start in life because they can't save the nest egg. And that's the big burden that this debt is placing, and the high levels of taxation are placing on the American society. You know, in order to have a growing, prosperous, dynamic economy, you generally have to have a large savings rate in that society. Nobody's saving any money anymore. At least people in the lower and middle classes, people are just barely making ends meet. And so you don't have this key, the accumulation of capital that is necessary for rising standards of living. And in fact, you get to a point finally where people are spending more than they're earning on a private basis trying to make ends meet, and that's when you really have this implosion factor, because people can't afford to pay their taxes and at the same time sustain the lives of their families. And let me say something about your point about George W. Bush is really good, because this is one of the arguments we made, Richard, as you'll recall, in the run-up to the Iraq War, when here at FFF we were one of those fervently opposing it, not just on moral grounds that the U.S. has no business attacking a country that has never attacked the United States, waging a war of aggression, but and all the bogus stuff of the WMDs and stuff. But we also pointed out that how were they going to pay for this? And George W. Bush said, well, I don't want to incur any ire from the American people, so I won't raise taxes. He went out and borrowed the money, and primarily from the Chinese Communist regime. That's how they became principal creditors of the U.S. government, this communist regime that the U.S. government owes money to. And so, he financed the Iraq War. People were saying this is fantastic, and that started the march toward the $20 trillion in debt that we're now in today.
Yes, it must be kept in mind by our conservative friends who say, oh, it's the Democrats who get into office and are the spendthrifts. They're the ones. Now, it certainly is the case that FDR in the 30s, Lyndon Johnson with his guns and butter attempt to have the Great Society plus the Vietnam War, all helped generate this terrible problem with this presumption of deficit spending being okay and the start of all this debt accumulation. But the Republicans have been as responsible for this as their Democratic colleagues in government. And George W. Bush stands out as sort of the poster boy for that fact, that this has been a problem created by both Republicans and Democrats. And there's equal responsibility for their various alternative forms of statist agendas, domestic policies, foreign adventure policies, all of which have put the American people of rising taxes, as well as this annual budget deficits that has resulted in this vast accumulation of debt.
I think we should keep in mind here the importance of what government should be doing and should not be doing. I mean, that really is an important question here. And maybe the massive amount of the debt will cause people to ask that question. Because if people, you're right, the welfare state, starting in Franklin Roosevelt's era, and then later the warfare state, has been really the impetus behind this massive amount of government spending that culminates with the George W. Bush administration, the war of aggression against Iraq, and then continues exponentially through the Obama administration, and is going to continue through the Trump administration. And notice what they always do, every president, including Trump, is saying, well, we don't really need to slash spending. I'm going to rely on growth. And what do they mean by growth? Well, they mean that, more people are going to be going to work and producing more taxes, paying more taxes, and therefore the tax revenues will go up, that therefore enable them to continue spending, maybe use a little bit of the debt, that they don't have to slash any spending at all. And this is just a pipe dream, Richard, because the people in society can't sustain that anymore. I mean, businesses are going out of business, like because of the minimum wage, which causes more people to go on the dole. So you've reached this point where you have the dole society and the warfare state society, where nobody wants to let go of their dole, and the amount of spending continues to skyrocket. that's where we libertarians come in, is causing people to think about, do we really want a welfare state at all? Do we really want a warfare state? I mean, you've got these forever wars in Afghanistan, forever wars in Iraq, the Middle East, that if we were to bring all these troops home and dismantle this Cold War era national security establishment, all of a sudden we're talking about a major decrease in government spending. If we start talking about, well, should government be involved in the business of taking money from some people and giving it to others, in the business of coerced charity, then all of a sudden we start talking about dismantling the entire welfare state structure that Roosevelt helped bring into existence. That all of a sudden means government isn't spending very much money. If we look at the regulatory side of this thing and say, well, should government be putting people in jail for ingesting drugs? Then all of a sudden we're talking about a huge decrease in spending. Should government be regulating economic activity? All of a sudden we're talking about a huge decrease in spending. So in the process of arguing against this massive amount of debt, against raising the debt ceiling again, we libertarians bring an added dimension to the table, and that is we question the entire framework that is providing the impetus for this out-of-control spending and debt.
Yes, and I think it helps in bringing that to the forefront by reminding people in these debates over deficits and balanced budgets and so on and debt limits as to what is basically driving this. Now, defense spending is huge. The United States spends more on defense than a whole bunch of other leading countries in the world combined. We're talking about big bucks here. But the fact is that the real driving force that is leading to more government spending, more deficits of taxes are not raised in terms of increasing size of deficits. And the Congressional Budget Office says that after 2023, the $1 trillion a year deficits will be back with no abating in them. It is the domestic welfare states programs of Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, and the related things that the Social Security Administration and the Medicare Administration handle and do. Why do I say that? Because you can put those two programs together, and they represent around 65% of current government spending in this year's government budget. The debt is another 70%. That is, the interest on the net debt is another 7%. So if you add together Social Security and its related administrative programs, Medicare and its related administrative programs, and the interest on the debt, we're talking about 70% of everything that government spends. The foreign policy issues have to be dealt with, as you emphasize, if I emphasize, has been a hallmark of FFS policies for certainly since the Bush administration with all these wars and before. But the core problem right now is domestic welfare state entitlement spending that is literally out of control under current legislation. Because there's the idea of untouchable expenditures. Under current legislation, what is projected to be the demographics of people reaching retirement, eligible for Social Security, and these medical programs, and the eligibility issue. This is an entitlement. You get to this age or you have this medical problem, the government just opens its horn of plenty. And with an aging population, this is where the growth is exponentially most dangerous to these financial matters that could lead to that implosion like Greece that you were emphasizing. So yes, defense spending has to be gotten under control. The wars have to be ended. But our major problem is at home in being addicted to the welfare redistributive state.
Yeah, it's the welfare warfare state. And as you know, there's economists out there that say, oh, no, this government spending is fantastic. This new debt is great. It produces jobs for America. It gets things humming again. It injects new life into the economy. This is all nonsense. It's quack, snake oil type remedies. I mean, the way I like to think of it, Richard, is suppose you and your spouse have incurred a debt of $100,000 in credit cards, and right. you've got an income of, let's say, $50,000 a year, and you're spending $75,000 a year. Well, it's logical you're going to add another $25,000 to your $100,000 in debt. You do it the next year, you're now in debt $150,000. The
Right.
only way to get, and that debt is hanging over you. That it is affecting your lifestyle. It's affecting what you do, vacations, what you purchase, and so forth. People learn that over time, the best thing to do is to get out of debt, and that's why they pay their homes down as quickly as they can, or their cars. And the way to do that, though, is that you slash your spending so that now you're not spending $75,000 anymore. You're spending $25,000 now. You're still making $50,000. You take that $25,000 of surplus and you use it to pay down your debt.
Right.
The same principle applies to the government. It's
Correct.
quite simple. It's a real
Now,
no-brainer here.
Yeah, if one asks the question, where could this lead, besides an example like Greece, if I can refer to a book review that was written by the famous Austrian-born economist Joseph Schumpeter of John Maynard Keynes' famous book, The General Theory, shortly after it came out in 1936, in which, of course, Keynes was making this case, deficit spending, government priming the pump and everything. And Schumpeter ended his review of Keynes' book in saying, well, a stellar example should have been royal France before the French Revolution. Here was the king, Louis XVI. He's spending openly. He hires professional spenders like Marie Antoinette and Madame de Pompadour. Wealth and prosperity and happiness should have come to the French people. What was the end result? Terror, revolution, and death. And then Schumpeter says, but of course that was pure coincidence.
on that great story, we got to wrap up because that's exactly where the U.S. is headed. It seems to me. Richard, greatly enjoyed it as always.
Thank you, and thanks to our viewers and listeners for listening in.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see y'all next week.